Child harasses old woman during flight. Mom cries when the woman does this. The airplane hummed softly as passengers settled into their seats. Outside, the evening light shimmered over the wings, promising an ordinary flight to Chicago. Near the back of the plane sat Mrs. Henderson, a silver-haired woman in her late 70s, dressed neatly in a pale blue sweater. She placed her handbag carefully under the seat and folded her hands, grateful for a quiet journey ahead. But peace didn't last long. A sharp thud hit the back of her seat, jolting her forward. She frowned, adjusting her glasses. Another kick followed, harder this time. Behind her, a young girl swung her legs carelessly, thumping the seat with the steady rhythm of a drum. The child's mother, her hair frazzled and eyes tired, bent over and whispered something to her daughter. But the kicking didn't stop. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She tried to focus on the low murmur of passengers chatting, the faint hiss of the air vents, the comforting clink of seatbelts locking into place. But then a small hand reached through the narrow gap between the seats and tugged gently, then firmly, at her hair. Her heart jumped. She turned halfway, startled, locking eyes with a pair of mischievous blue ones staring back at her. The little girl giggled, unbothered. The mother looked mortified, stammering an apology, but her voice carried exhaustion more than authority. Mrs. Henderson forced a polite smile and nodded stiffly, turning back toward the window. The engines roared louder. The plane began to roll forward, trembling as it prepared for takeoff. Another kick, another tug, a soft giggle. Mrs. Henderson's fingers tightened around the armrest. She'd raised children once. She knew mischief. But this felt different. The laughter behind her wasn't playful anymore. It grated, like a test of patience she hadn't signed up for. As the plane lifted into the sky, her seat jolted again. A few passengers glanced over, frowning. The mother whispered an apology that was swallowed by the noise of the engines. Mrs. Henderson stared straight ahead, her expression calm, but her jaw tight. Somewhere deep down, something in her stirred, an old ache she couldn't quite name. She told herself to endure it, to stay quiet. Yet the longer the flight went on, the louder that ache became, until silence no longer felt possible. Mrs. Henderson sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the tray table in front of her. The little plastic latch rattled with every kick from behind. She pressed her lips together, the fine lines around her mouth deepening. The child's laughter rose above the steady hum of the plane, sharp and restless. The mother leaned forward again, whispering a plea that sounded more like a sigh than a command. The girl ignored her, swinging her legs, her sneakers drumming a careless rhythm. A doll slipped from her hands and tumbled into the aisle. The mother unbuckled, reaching down to grab it, murmuring an apology to everyone within earshot. A man across the aisle muttered something under his breath. A woman in front turned to glance back. The tension in the air thickened like humidity before a storm. Mrs. Henderson lifted her cup of tea, hoping the warmth would calm her, but another jolt sent a drop splashing onto her lap. She dabbed at it with a napkin, her hand trembling slightly. Her mind drifted uninvited to another time, another plane ride, when a small child cried for hours beside her. The memory was blurred, the sound of sobbing echoing somewhere far away. She blinked hard, forcing herself back to the present. The girl's voice rose again, humming tunelessly now, her small feet still moving. The mother gave up for a moment, slumping into her seat, eyes closed in defeat. A flight attendant passed by, offering a practiced smile. "Kids can be tough travelers," she said lightly, as if that explained everything. Mrs. Henderson tried to smile back, but it came out thin and tight. Minutes stretched into small eternities. The old woman's shoulders stiffened, her neck ached, and the thumping behind her seat became almost unbearable. She reached up to adjust the vent above her head, more to occupy her hands than for the cool air it provided. Another kick, another tug. The soft sound of childish humming continued, unbothered by the discomfort it caused. Mrs. Henderson turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the girl's reflection in the window beside her. Those bright blue eyes met hers for a second, wide and unguarded. The kicking stopped. In that moment, something in the old woman's chest shifted, quietly, without warning. The steady roar of the engines filled the cabin as Mrs. Henderson sat back in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The tension still hung heavy between the rows, though the little girl behind her had gone quiet for the moment. The silence felt uneasy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Henderson reached down and pulled her handbag closer. Her fingers brushed against something inside. Soft leather, worn smooth from years of use. She lifted out a small brown sketchbook, the edges frayed, its pages slightly curled. A pencil rolled from the spine and into her palm. She opened it on her tray table, the faint smell of paper and graphite filling the small space around her. The mother looked up, puzzled, as the woman began to draw. The soft, rhythmic scratch of pencil against paper rose above the hum of the plane. A few passengers nearby glanced over, curious. Mrs. Henderson didn't notice them. Her movements were slow, steady, sure. Her hands trembled only when the turbulence rattled the cabin. Behind her, the girl's breathing steadied. She leaned forward, peering through the narrow space between the seats. The sound of the pencil fascinated her. She pressed her cheek against the armrest, trying to see more. The old woman didn't turn around. She simply kept drawing, the tip of her pencil gliding in careful lines across the page. The child's kicking stopped altogether. Her small fingers rested on the seat back, motionless now. Her voice, once shrill and restless, quieted into a soft hum, barely a whisper. The mother exhaled, shoulders dropping in relief. For the first time since takeoff, she didn't have to whisper apologies. She watched, not daring to interrupt whatever spell had settled over her daughter. The minutes passed slowly. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting cups and napkins. The faint sound of laughter and conversation drifted from other rows, but here there was only stillness. Mrs. Henderson turned a page, adding a few last strokes, then paused. Her pencil hovered above the paper for a moment before she set it down. The girl behind her waited, eyes wide, wondering what the quiet woman had created in the pages of that old weathered book. The plane rocked gently through a patch of thin clouds, and the seatbelt sign flickered on above the rows. Mrs. Henderson glanced at it but didn't move. The page before her was finished now, faint smudges of graphite dusting her fingertips. She studied it quietly, her lips curving into the slightest smile. She tore the page carefully from the sketchbook, folding along the edge so it would come away clean. The sound of the paper ripping drew a few curious glances. The mother behind her shifted, unsure of what was happening. Mrs. Henderson turned slowly in her seat, the drawing held in her wrinkled hands. The little girl blinked up at her, surprised. Her sneakers were still, her body leaning forward as if afraid to breathe. Mrs. Henderson extended the paper toward her. For a second, the child didn't move. Then she reached out, taking it with both hands. The drawing filled the page. It was simple, done in pencil, but alive with feeling. The girl sat at its center, surrounded by soft lines that shaped wings, wide and graceful. A faint light radiated around her head, and her face, calm, smiling, looked nothing like the fidgeting child from moments ago. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The mother's eyes widened. She pressed her fingers to her lips, staring at the image her daughter now held. The girl's voice came out small, uncertain. "Am I really like this?" she asked, her gaze moving from the page to the woman's face. Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened as she nodded once, the corners of her mouth lifting gently. The child's shoulders lowered. Her breathing slowed. She stared at the drawing again, tracing one finger along the outline of the wings. The restless energy that had filled her body since boarding seemed to drain away. The mother wiped at her eyes, her face a mix of confusion and gratitude. Around them, the air seemed to settle. Even the passengers nearby felt the shift, an odd, quiet peace replacing the earlier tension. Mrs. Henderson turned back to her seat. The engines droned steadily outside, but inside, all was still. Behind her, the little girl held the paper close to her chest, as if protecting something precious. The hum of the engines softened as the flight neared its end. The clouds outside glowed orange in the fading light, and the cabin lights dimmed to a soft, golden hue. Mrs. Henderson closed her sketchbook and rested it on her lap. Behind her, the quiet continued, broken only by the low chatter of passengers preparing for landing. The mother leaned forward, her voice gentle now. She asked if she could see the drawing again. The little girl nodded and handed it to her carefully, as if it might tear from the slightest touch. The mother looked at it for a long moment, her eyes glistening in the warm cabin light. She turned toward the old woman, her voice unsteady as she spoke. She said she didn't know how to thank her, that her daughter hadn't been that calm in years. Mrs. Henderson smiled softly, shaking her head. She said nothing at first, only reached back to pat the woman's hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost carried away by the hum of the engines. She said she used to work with children long ago, helping them through things they couldn't explain. The mother nodded slowly, her tears spilling freely now. She told the old woman that her husband had passed the year before, and ever since, her daughter had been frightened of almost everything. Planes, loud noises, strangers, anything that felt out of her control. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened even more. She turned slightly in her seat, meeting the little girl's eyes. She told her she was brave, and that sometimes bravery doesn't look quiet or perfect. Sometimes it just means showing up. As the wheels touched down, a gentle applause rippled through the cabin. The girl pressed the drawing against her chest, smiling shyly at the woman in front of her. She reached for a crayon from her backpack and began to scribble quickly on a napkin. When the plane rolled to a stop, she leaned over the seat and handed it to Mrs. Henderson. It was a small picture. 2 figures with halos, holding hands. The child's voice was soft but clear. "Now you're an angel too," she said. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with quiet tears as the cabin doors opened and sunlight poured in.